Good morning and welcome to Rising. Thank you so much for tuning in. We've got a great show for you today. Lots of news to get to, including lots happening in the Middle East. We're going to take a closer look at the Syria situation. I'm joined by Niall Stanich. Nice to have you with me.
Always a pleasure to be here, Robby, even on a rather misty Tuesday morning in Washington.
Yes, indeed.
We have indeed a lot to cover, so no point in wasting any time. Robby, what's on your radar?
Well, we're learning more about the suspect arrested in the shocking murder of Unitedhealthcare Chief Executive Brian Thompson in New York City last week. That suspect is 26-year-old Luigi Mangione. The authorities have not yet identified a definitive motive, although there are certainly clues in his backstory. He reportedly lost both his grandparents and was resentful of the medical care they had received, according to the New York Post. He also formerly worked in an assisted living facility, and his well-off family is financially tied to senior rehabilitation centers. Now, when arrested by the police, Mangione was carrying a gun, a silencer, and a handwritten manifesto containing such declarations as, quote, "These parasites had it coming." Authorities described the manifesto as evincing hostility toward corporate America. Mangione also wrote, "To the feds, I'll keep this short because I do respect what you do for our country. To save you a lengthy investigation, I state plainly that I wasn't working with anyone." Mangione's friends and family are shocked by the alleged killing, though they say he had recently began acting oddly and had virtually disappeared from their lives. Now, a person of not insignificant wealth and privilege, Mangione grew up in Maryland and attended the prestigious Gilman School in Baltimore, a private school that cost nearly $40,000 per year. He was the valedictorian of his graduating class and went on to earn an engineering degree from the University of Pennsylvania. He was part of a fraternity. He founded a video game development club and became a data engineer, subsequently moving to California and then to Hawaii. All indications suggest he was an intelligent, social, good-looking young man with very promising employment prospects. Perpetrators of disturbing crimes such as these are often deranged and antisocial losers, but this person was, by all accounts, normal, successful, and well-adjusted, at least until recently. So what happened? Again, we can only speculate, but judging by his account on X, he had become extremely concerned recently about anxiety, retweeting links to Jonathan Haidt, a psychologist who posits that smartphones and social media are harming the mental health outcomes of young people. He also posted in favor of psychedelics as the cure for anxiety. Luke Goldstein, a writer for the American Prospect, who had a mutual friend with Mangione, claims that he was a former wrestler and recently had had back surgery and was considered by his friends to be missing. Other former friends and acquaintances have also come forward confirming that, saying to a variety of media outlets that his recent back surgery had actually left him in crippling pain and in a precarious psychological situation. More disturbingly, he seemed to find the work of Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, to be thought-provoking. Mangione had posted a positive review of the notorious eco-terrorist manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future, and made the following observations, quote, "It's easy to quickly and thoughtlessly write this off as the manifesto of a lunatic in order to avoid facing some of the uncomfortable problems it identifies, but it's simply impossible to ignore how prescient many of his predictions about modern society turned out to be. He was a violent individual, rightfully imprisoned, who maimed innocent people. While these actions tend to be characterized as those of a crazy Luddite, however, they are more accurately seen as those of an extreme political revolutionary. When all other forms of communication fail, violence is necessary to survive. You may not like his methods, but to see things from his perspective, it's not terrorism, it's war and revolution." End quote. Mangione's support for the Unabomber has led authorities to brand him an anti-capitalist and an environmental extremist. Writing on X, Senator Ted Cruz said, "Leftism is a mental disease. The suspected murderer, an Ivy League graduate, subscribed to anti-capitalist and climate change causes, according to law enforcement. And the murderer has been widely celebrated by leftists online. Tragic and sick," end quote. It is undoubtedly true that some progressive people, some socialist people, seemingly rejoiced in the murder of Brian Thompson and made excuses for the killer, otherwise justifying violence against a person who is an important cog in a machine, the American healthcare system, that they think is not just badly run, but evil. Perhaps Mangione shared those sentiments, although I would caution that while he has certainly expressed left-coded political views vis-a-vis his enthusiasm for the Unabomber, may very well end up being more complicated than that. One can also find evidence online of him complaining about falling birth rates in Japan, the ugliness of modern architecture. That tends to be a right-coded opinion, one I share. As always, it is important not to blame one group or another, an ideology, heated rhetoric, etc., for the actions of an individual. We are just beginning to understand what motivated this man. End of the day, it ultimately doesn't matter. Murder is murder. It's wrong. The motive is political, if it's revenge, if it's tied to a personal situation, it's because his back hurts and it drove him insane. Even if it was completely random, it would still be wrong. Most people know that instinctively. For those who found themselves cheering on such events, maybe reconsider. So we always end up doing this, Niall.
Yes.
We always end up looking for why, what was the reason, because I think it's because of TVs and movies. We imagine that people who commit violence have some very carefully formulated grand strategy or ideology, and you can trace the steps of their radicalization. What often turns out is that it's much more complicated than that. They have some crazy views in a variety of directions. It could be not really his views, but his medical condition, which we are now receiving more and more friends coming forward saying something happened with his back and he appeared to snap and go crazy. Maybe he was doing psychedelics, as he seems to suggest from his social media presence. So I always caution against trying to see the why, because they start with trying to see the why of the ideology and then blame other people who share that ideology or promoters of their ideology. And so I would always caution against that, but in this case it seems particularly important to do so, because he is being lightly lionized, might be the wrong word, but excused by some people on the left. Certainly not all of them. But
Joe, well, and I don't actually think it is entirely a left-right thing. I mean, I would disagree with what Ted Cruz said, for example, on a number of levels. Firstly, I think the labeling of leftism as a mental disease, I think that is just wrong and nonsense. And I would say the same if someone said conservatism or rightism.
Sure, I agree with
that. That's just not, doesn't get us anywhere. But it is also part of the process you're talking about it trying to place this guy in a neat ideological box. And many people cannot be placed in neat ideological boxes. They change and shift around there. I do think, I mean, I take the point that some people have actually gloated in the killing, and of course I think that's wrong. We shouldn't be gloating about anyone's killing. I do think that there are, to the extent that we know his views of the American healthcare system, I think a lot of people share those views. A lot of people, regardless of political ideology, feel a real rage at what they consider the avarice and callousness of insurance companies. And obviously one can come to that view in a general sense, but many people don't. And you mentioned Mr. Mangione's grandparents, who are apparently part of this narrative. I think one of the reasons that health insurance and health insurers elicit such strong feelings is because the negative experience of them tends to be either when one is oneself sick or when people who one loves are sick. And therefore, it is a very viscerally experienced anger or disappointment.
Yeah, especially if you separate it into, the kind of care you get from the healthcare system is, well, I mean, by historical standards, is very good. We have the ability to treat people, keep people alive much longer, people live longer, to keep people, prevent serious pain and injury, and that ability has improved over time. Although some people would argue that there's been somewhat of a stagnation in recent decades in the quality of care you get from a hospital, that it's actually not dramatically better than it was in, for instance, like since the 70s or something like that. Certainly relative to the cost. That's the part of it where I absolutely know there's this frustration. And just, and I'm sure you and I disagree, and people on the right and left disagree about what's the right system to fix, and obviously you come from a country with a very different system, but we're like in this middle ground system where the price of everything is very confusing and you don't really know what you're paying for, and like if you look very closely at the bill, you're like, why does this, why do the drugs cost 10 times more here and I could just get them here and it would be different, and it's partly government run, partly not government run, and the incentives to just charge more are very bad. So maybe he was, raging against that kind of frustration, or maybe he just had a psychotic break, because
Yeah.
sometimes that happens to people.
Something that sometimes that does happen. I do think he appears to have been raging against the health insurance industry. I think there are legitimate reasons for that. As you say, all the incentives are just to lob more money into the system, and oftentimes people are understandably frustrated by that.
Well, we've got a lot more coming up today on Rising, including an in-depth look at the situation in Syria. That's coming up next. Stay with us.